Welcome to this week's Session of Insight. During this week's show, we're going to cover two topics. The first one is going to be recent reforms that were proposed about expanding the role of women in the Armenian military. And the second one, and by far the more important and the most important issue of the last couple of months or years, as we can say, is statements that the Prime Minister made in regards to Artsakh. Let's start off with the first topic of the week, which is the expanding the role of women in the Armenian military. The Armenian government approved a set of amendments on the law on military service, which creates a legal basis for women to serve in the armed forces on a voluntary basis. According to Defense Minister Eric Hacopian, the military service for women will be for 6 months. All women conscripts will be sent to training centers and will serve exclusively there. Upon completion of service, they will receive a bonus of 1 million drams, which is a little over $2,000. And in the case of early completion of service, the bonus will be paid for time served. And after that, the women will have the opportunity to sign up for essentially 5 years on a 5-year contract to serve in the military. Now, what does this all mean? Frankly, this is a great development on many fronts. Modern warfare, as it is right now, actually it greatly expands the ability of women to serve in the military on many different functions. And as we know, some of the most capable people in this country are women, and the best example of that is in the IT sector, where Armenian women overperform at 36-37% compared to all other IT sectors in the world, and they essentially outperform all women around the world. And third of all, in almost all developed countries, women serve on almost all levels of the military. And most importantly, from my perspective, this is another step in the establishment of what we need, which is a garrison state and a complete militarization of society, which is happening anyway, but these reforms allow us to sort of formalize it into the actual military. To sum this up, one of the reasons this story actually captivated me, because I think there's actually a very moral and political component to this. One of the horrific things that we remember from last year were the war crimes that were committed against Armenian women who were found dead on the battlefield by our fascist enemies. And frankly, I cannot think of a better answer to their fascist barbarism than the fact that we're going to actually double down and we're going to have more women in these positions. And I think our enemies on the other side will actually get the response to all the things and the crimes that they committed against women in Armenia and the women soldiers, and they will get it in terms that they probably won't like. Now let's move on to the second topic of the week, which is obviously the very controversial statement made by the Prime Minister in his speech a couple of days ago. First, we'll start off with something that is not at the heart of the matter, which is he made a comment about Armenia's CSTO membership. CSTO is the poor man's NATO that we're a part of, that's led by Russia, in which he said that getting out of CSTO is actually on the table, and the issue that he brought up was that it actually is blocking us from purchasing weapons from different countries, specifically Western countries, which is actually interesting. This is not something that we expected a couple of months ago, but I think it's quite realistic that at some point this year, depending on how things go, this is actually a move that this country can make. Now let's get to the heart of the most controversial things that he said. He repeatedly stated about the mutual recognition of the two countries, Armenia and Azerbaijan, accepting each other's territorial integrity, and he very specifically mentioned that he accepts Artsakh as part of Azerbaijan's territory, and it's part of accepting each other's territorial integrity. He went on to say that all Armenian governments have done this in the past, which is actually not the case. All Armenian governments said the Artsakh is a very specific issue that needs to be resolved between the Armenians of Artsakh and Azerbaijan, and they did not accept full Azeri sovereignty over Artsakh. He went on to say about the importance and necessity of a mechanism to guarantee the securities and the rights of Armenians in Artsakh, which should be supervised by the international community between the two sides. Otherwise, it would lead to ethnic cleansing. He clearly said that. The Artsakh response to this was strong and very swift. And this is from the Artsakh parliament. For us, any statement by Nikol Pashinyan ignoring Artsakh's sovereignty or our people's right to self-determination is null and void. Then I'll quote the speaker of the Artsakh parliament, Artur Thomasyan, who said, "What rights and security guarantees can we talk about when Azerbaijan has illegally been keeping Artsakh under a complete blockade for 162 days? and he's obviously 100% correct. There were denouncements of this statement and this policy by almost the entire former and current leadership of Artsakh, including some very strong statements from former State Minister Ruben Vardanyan. Let's go over the primary problem and the issues around what the Prime Minister was saying. First and foremost, that he does not directly tie the recognition of Azeri territorial integrity with an absolutely agreed upon set of negotiation systems in place to secure the rights and securities of people of Artsakh, because without them, they're meaningless. Secondly, what incentive does the regime in Baku have to discuss rights and securities when you have already given to them what they want most, which is for you to publicly say that you consider Artsakh to be Azeri territory. Third, there's absolutely nothing in the language about the current illegal and cruel blockade that is being foisted upon the people of Artsakh, who are isolated from the world, without gas, without electricity, and with limited food supplies for the past 6 months. This is an issue that needs to be prioritized, frankly, above all others, including the signing of the peace treaty because of its immediate humanitarian concerns. Now, why do I specifically stress on this particular issue? Because this blockade actually is the vehicle to make the absolute moral and legal and political case that given the actions of this regime, whose goals are genocidal and whose actual goal is to ethnically cleanse Armenians of Artsakh, disproves the notion that there can ever be any guaranteed rights for people living under such a regime. And this is something that should be weaponized politically and aggressively used to make that case to the world to isolate the regime in Baku. Lastly, he has never defined in clear terms to the Armenian people and the public what he means by rights and securities. Tell us what your standards are. What is it that you're demanding? What is it that's being discussed? The people in this country are owed that. Far too many people have sacrificed too much and shed too much blood for us not to be part of this conversation. Now let's move on and talk about, in real terms, what would a conversation around rights and securities about the people of Artsakh would mean if it's actually a real process. First and foremost, talks between the government of Artsakh and the regime in Baku need to be mediated by the international community. It needs to be in a summit format where there's a mediator that actually supervises these conversations. Secondly, and more importantly, is that any agreement reached between the two sides need to be guaranteed by the international community, given the wretched nature of the regime in Baku and their inability to keep any of the promises or agreements that they ever come to. And lastly, and most importantly, it would require presence, an international presence on the ground in Artsakh to make sure that these agreements are actually agreed upon, and that the regime in Baku does not violate them. In essence, to take away the current ineffective, useless Russian peacekeepers and replace them with international ones. That could be realistic or not, but that should definitely be the third and most important part of what we're demanding. Now, moving forward, well, what is it likely to happen in the future if this thing actually is ever signed, or as we move forward in this process? The truth of the matter is that signing of any peace agreement will not necessarily bring peace. Peace, in fact, will not be achieved by giving up the rights of the people in Artsakh to self-determination. In fact, that is almost a guarantee of us having another war sometime in the future. There is no reason to believe that after signing a peace agreement, that the regime in Baku would implement any of parts of the agreement. For example, who really believes that Ilham Aliyev is going to leave occupied Armenian territory that he's captured over the last 2 years? Who believes he's actually going to free the POWs, and who believes he's actually going to sit and negotiate in good faith with the people in Artsakh when his intentions is ethnic cleansing and genocide? On this issue, frankly, the Prime Minister is entirely out of step with public opinion. According to polling, 70% of Armenians oppose his current approach and policies in Artsakh. And frankly, the public has moved on from this peace rhetoric that he keeps talking about. They actually don't believe it. And in truth, everybody is expecting war, and frankly, everyone's expecting for war. So this talk is almost meaningless to most people. More importantly, frankly, he has no mandate to make these concessions based on, this is not what he won election on, in 2021. So this is something that he's going down a slippery slope where he's actually taking on general public opinion. Now, he is most likely going to be rescued by Ilham Aliyev because he will almost certainly never sign a peace agreement, or most very, very likely he won't sign a peace agreement, for reasons that we've repeated over many, many times over the last few months and years, which is, one, he can't be rid of his Armenian enemy. Second of all, he will never negotiate anything that precludes his right to ethnically cleanse Artsakh. And three, he will never burn his bridges with the Russian state, which any of these Western agreements will force him to do. In the meantime, however, what Ilham Aliyev is going to do is he's going to take and pocket this concession that this country and this prime minister has made to rationalize all future aggressions against Armenia and Artsakh. Because if you're saying it's entirely theirs and it's their territorial integrity, who are you to tell them not to have aggressions inside of their own territories? In truth, as we know, there's only one road to peace. That is when we create a situation by upgrading our military capabilities where the risk of war to regime survival in Baku is actually greater than the risk of peace for the regime in Baku. To believe or have any illusions that after signing a peace agreement, Ilham Aliyev is actually going to live up to any of the points of the agreement is naive in the extreme level. And frankly, we have an example of that. On the November 9th agreement, there were 9 points, and he has simply violated every single one of them. So to believe otherwise is to be living in a world of illusions. Dear Mr. Prime Minister, it is true that our new Western friends are not our enemies, as the Russian state has proved itself to be over the last months and years. But however, that does not mean they are our friends. They simply want one outcome, which is to push the Russian state out of this region, except they want us to pay the entirety of the cost for their exit. To our Western friends, to your negotiation scenario which you have set up, in which the democratic side is the only side that makes concessions, while the fascist side makes no concessions, and whose aggressions and criminal behavior, like the illegal blockade, are always excused, is simply not politically sustainable. In conclusion, I can assure everyone that there's not much of a political market in this country for our local version of Mikhail Gorbachev. And as we all know, and this is especially important to our Western friends, waiting on stage 2, when you actually have a Mikhail Gorbachev, are going to be leaders who are much more apt to use Bolshevik methods when it comes to dealing with our enemies. Thank you for joining me in this week's episode of Insights.
Это Горбачев.
Горбачев?
Это из-за него у нас в экономике бардак.
Да благодаря ему у нас новые возможности.
Это из-за него у нас политическая нестабильность.
Да благодаря ему у нас свобода.
Полный хаос.
Перспективы.
Политическая нестабильность.
Да благодаря ему у нас есть писахат.
За Горбачева!
За Горбачева!
За Горбачева! За Горбачева!
Sometimes nothing brings people together like a nice hot pizza from Pizza Hut.